In the spring of 1995, an estate sale in Branson, Missouri, yielded a photograph that would shatter everything historians thought they knew about the Dowell family. The image showed two pale women in Victorian dress beside a young man. On the reverse, faded ink read, Eliza, Clara, and Azaz and Samuel Dowell, 1899. Quick question before we continue. What's the creepiest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. And while you're here, make sure you click the like button and subscribe to the channel. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. An antique dealer named Martin Keller stood motionless in the crowded living room, holding a battered tin box he had just purchased. The photograph measured roughly 4 inches by 6, mounted on thick cardboard that had yellowed with age. The edges were frayed, the surface scratched and water-stained, yet the faces remained clear enough to send a chill through anyone familiar with Missouri history. On the reverse, in faded ink that required careful examination under lamplight, someone had written, Eliza, Clara, and Samuel Dowell, 1899. Keller stood motionless in the crowded living room of the estate house, other buyers shuffling past him toward furniture and china. He recognized the Dowell name immediately. Anyone who had lived in Taney County long enough knew the whispers, the legends that parents told children to keep them from wandering too far into the hills. The Dowell sisters, daughters kept in shadow, mothers of children who should never have been born. But no one had ever mentioned a brother. The dealer turned the photograph over again, studying the 3 figures more closely. The women stood on either side of the man, their dresses identical, their faces bearing that uncanny resemblance that comes only from shared blood. The man himself appeared perhaps 20 years of age, his features sharp and troubled, his stance rigid, as though he wanted to flee but could not move his feet. Behind them stood a weathered farmhouse with shuttered windows, and there, barely visible in the shadowed doorway, were 2 small figures watching. Keller squinted, bringing the photograph closer to his face. The figures were children, though their faces held an odd quality that made them difficult to focus on. Even more disturbing, their features seemed to echo all 3 adults in the photograph, a blending of characteristics that should not exist in nature. One child's face bore the shape of the brother's jaw, combined with Clara's delicate nose. The other showed Eliza's wide-set eyes paired with what looked like the brother's distinctive brow. He purchased the tin box for $15, the seller barely glancing at its contents. The woman running the estate sale mentioned only that the box had belonged to distant relatives, people whose names she did not recall, whose history held no interest for her. She wanted it gone along with everything else, the house sold and emptied before winter. Back at his shop in Springfield, Keller examined the photograph under better light. What he had thought were shadows in the doorway became clearer. The children were real, documented in that frozen moment of 1899. But there was something else, something he had missed in the dim light of the estate sale. At the very edge of the frame, barely visible, was a 4th figure. One of the women held an infant in her arms, its tiny face turned toward the camera. Even in the faded photograph, the signs were unmistakable. The enlarged skull, the peculiar spacing of features, the frailty that marked children born of blood too close. This was no ordinary family portrait. It was evidence. The photographer who had taken this image must have been driven away shortly after, must have sensed that he had captured something forbidden. Yet somehow the photograph survived, hidden away in a tin box, passed through generations, until it surfaced at an estate sale nearly a century later. The Dowell family had been more than just rumors and whispered warnings. They had existed, all of them together, and someone had documented the proof. Keller placed the photograph carefully on his desk and reached for the phone. He knew a genealogist in Kansas City who specialized in Ozark family histories, a woman who had spent years tracing the dark corners of Missouri's past. If anyone could make sense of this discovery, it would be Sarah Brennan, because what lay in that tin box was not just a photograph. It was the key to understanding what had really happened on that ridge, and who had truly fathered the most inbred children Taney County had ever seen. Sarah Brennan arrived at Keller's shop 3 days later, her leather satchel stuffed with census records and family tree charts. She had spent the better part of 2 decades tracing Ozark bloodlines, untangling the complicated webs of rural Missouri families, where cousins married cousins, and record-keeping remained haphazard at best. But when Keller described the photograph over the phone, something in his voice made her cancel her afternoon appointments and drive straight to Springfield. The moment she saw the image, her hands began to tremble. She had researched the Dowell case years earlier, compiling what fragments existed into a thin folder of newspaper clippings and almshouse records. Every account she had ever read mentioned only 2 daughters, Eliza and Clara, born in the early 1880s, sequestered after their mother's death in 1897. No brother, no Samuel. Yet here he stood, captured in 1899, his presence rewriting everything. Brennan spread her research across Keller's work table, pulling out census forms and birth certificates she had copied from county archives. The 1880 census listed the Dowell household clearly: Elias Dowell, head of family, age 30. Margaret Dowell, wife, age 28. 2 daughters, Eliza and Clara, ages 4 and 2. But then she unfolded an earlier document, one she had requested from Arkansas State Archives on a hunch after Keller's call. The 1881 birth register for Pulaski County, Arkansas, recorded the birth of Samuel Elias Dowell to Margaret Dowell, mother's residence listed as Taney County, Missouri. The child had been born during a visit to Margaret's sister, who lived near Little Rock. More significantly, a handwritten note in the margin indicated the boy remained with relatives in Arkansas for his upbringing. Brennan traced the timeline with her finger, speaking aloud as she pieced the story together. Margaret had given birth to Samuel first, in 1880, then sent him to live with her sister's family. Perhaps Elias had not wanted a son, or perhaps Margaret feared for the boy's safety. Either way, Samuel grew up 300 miles from his sisters, raised by an aunt and uncle whose surname appeared in Arkansas records as Gifford. The 1890 census confirmed it. Samuel Gifford, age 10, living in the household of Thomas and Ruth Gifford in Little Rock, listed as nephew. He attended school there, his name appearing on enrollment records through 1897. Then, abruptly, his trail in Arkansas ended. Brennan pulled out another document, this one from Missouri. The Taney County property tax records for 1898 showed a notation beside Elias Dowell's name: additional resident, male, adult. The assessor had counted Samuel in the household, though he had not bothered to record the name. Cross-referencing with the Forsyth General Store ledger, which shopkeepers used to track credit accounts, she found entries beginning in autumn of 1898 for E. Dowell and Son. Samuel had returned. At 18 years old, perhaps seeking his birth family after his Arkansas relatives could no longer keep him, he had made his way back to the ridge where his mother was buried and his sisters lived as prisoners. The timing chilled Brennan to her core. Margaret died in 1897. Samuel appeared in 1898. And according to the almshouse records she had studied years before, The first wave of severely deformed infants from the Dowell household began arriving in 1899. She looked again at the photograph. Samuel stood between his sisters, his face young and troubled. Had he returned to rescue them? Had he discovered the horror his father had inflicted upon Eliza and Clara, only to find himself trapped by the same isolation that had consumed them? Or had something darker drawn him back to that ridge, something that would make him not a savior, but another perpetrator? Brennan gathered the documents carefully, her mind already racing ahead to the next archive she needed to search. Birth certificates from the early 1900s would tell the story. She could find them. The fathers' names on those certificates, if recorded at all, would reveal whether Samuel had been victim or accomplice. Because the photograph proved one undeniable fact. By 1899, he was already part of the Dowell household, and the children in the doorway, their faces blending features from all three adults, suggested he had become far more than just a brother who came home. The Forsyth Baptist Association archives occupied a cramped basement room in the old church building, boxes stacked floor to ceiling with correspondence dating back to the 1860s. Brennan spent 2 days there, her fingers blackened with dust, searching for any mention of Samuel Dowell's return. What she found exceeded her darkest expectations. A letter dated October 18, 98, written by Reverend Amos Carter to the regional Baptist superintendent, described an unusual visit. A young man calling himself Samuel Dowell presented himself at services last Sunday, claiming kinship to Elias Dowell of the Ridge. He inquired after his sisters with great agitation, stating he had not seen them since infancy and wished to reunite with his family. I directed him to the homestead, though I confess unease at sending any soul to that place. The next letter, penned 3 weeks later, carried a different tone entirely. The Dowell boy has taken residence with his father and sisters. I called upon the household to welcome him properly, but was turned away at the door by Elias himself, who stated his family required no interference from the church. Through a window, I glimpsed the young man inside, his face pale and drawn, speaking in low tones with 2 women I presumed to be his sisters. There was an intimacy in their manner that troubled me, though I cannot say precisely why. Brennan photographed both letters with shaking hands. Carter had witnessed Samuel's arrival, had seen him enter the house where his sisters lived in isolation. But there was more. Tucked between the pages of a parish ledger, she discovered a personal diary Carter had kept, never meant for official records. The entry from December 18, 98 read, "I am plagued by what I observed at the Dowell place. The young man Samuel has been there 2 months now, and when I encountered him at the general store, he would not meet my eyes. He purchased supplies enough for a household of 5, though only 4 souls reside there officially. When I asked after his sister's health, he replied only that they were as well as could be expected given their circumstances. His hands trembled as he spoke. I fear that boy discovered horrors upon his return, horrors that have now claimed him as well." The diary continued with scattered observations through the winter. Samuel seen walking the ridge road at dusk, his shoulders hunched against wind, and something heavier. The sisters glimpsed briefly when Samuel opened the door to receive firewood deliveries, their faces identical masks of resignation. And then, in March of 1899, a single devastating line. Mrs. Kimball, the washerwoman, reports seeing infant clothing hung to dry behind the Dowell house. She swears she heard a baby's cry, thin and weak, quickly silenced. Brennan cross-referenced the date with her other documents. March 1899, 9 months after Samuel's return. The timing aligned perfectly with the first entry in the Greene County Almshouse records, describing an infant of irregular constitution brought from Taney County. The child had died within 2 weeks, its body buried in the pauper's field, with no name recorded. She found one final document in Carter's papers, a letter he had written, but never sent, addressed to the county sheriff. The Reverend had drafted a formal complaint, detailing his suspicions about the Dowell household. But he had crossed out entire paragraphs, rewritten sections, and ultimately folded the letter away unsigned. In the margin, he had scrawled a single question that echoed across the decades. How can I accuse a son of such things when he may himself be a prisoner? That question haunted Brennan as she packed her photographs and notes. Samuel had returned to the Ridge seeking family, seeking perhaps to save his sisters from whatever darkness he sensed in his father's letters, or simply from the isolation he knew they suffered. Instead, he had walked into a trap that would transform him from rescuer to participant. The photograph from 1899 captured him at that terrible threshold, standing between his sisters, already bound to them in ways that nature should forbid. And the children in the doorway proved he had crossed it. Brennan needed more than historical documents. She needed the photograph itself to reveal its secrets. In early June of 1995, she contacted Dr. Rebecca Marsh, a forensic photograph analyst at Washington University in St. Louis, who specialized in historical image enhancement. Marsh had worked on Civil War photographs and frontier daguerreotypes, using modern technology to extract details invisible to the naked eye. Keller agreed to loan the photograph for analysis, and 2 weeks later, Brennan sat in Marsh's laboratory, watching as the image appeared on a high-resolution computer screen. The analyst had scanned the photograph at extreme magnification, capturing every grain and shadow of the original. The chemistry of 1890's photographic emulsion preserves information our eyes cannot process, Marsh explained, adjusting the contrast levels. Watch what happens when I enhance the shadow areas. The doorway behind the 3 figures suddenly sharpened. The children Keller had noticed became painfully clear. They were perhaps 3 and 4 years old, standing side by side in identical threadbare dresses. But it was their faces that made Brennan lean closer to the screen, her breath catching in her throat. The older child possessed Samuel's angular jaw and high cheekbones, yet her eyes were unmistakably Clara's, wide-set and haunted. The younger bore Eliza's delicate nose and mouth, combined with Samuel's distinctive heavy brow. These were not children of Elias alone. They carried genetic markers from all 3 adults in the photograph, a blending that should exist only in nightmares. Marsh zoomed in further. There's something else. Look at the left edge of the frame. The image pixelated slightly, then resolved. Clara stood nearest to the camera's edge, and in her arms, so carefully positioned that the casual observer would miss it entirely, was an infant. The photographer had captured it in profile, its tiny head turned toward the lens. Can you enhance the infant's face? Brennan asked, though part of her wanted to stop, to leave that detail buried in shadow. Marsh worked silently for several minutes, adjusting brightness and sharpness until the baby's features emerged. The skull was misshapen, bulging at the forehead in a way that suggested severe hydrocephalus. The spacing between the eyes appeared too wide, the bridge of the nose flattened. Even in death, these signs were unmistakable markers of profound genetic abnormality. This child was alive when the photograph was taken, Marsh said quietly, pointing to a barely visible detail. See the slight blur around the mouth? That's movement. The baby was breathing, possibly crying, during the exposure. Brennan thought of the almshouse records, the physician's notes describing infants who rarely survived their first weeks. This child in the photograph had likely been one of them, born broken and destined for an unmarked grave. But its presence in the image proved something crucial. By 1899, the household was already producing children, and those children bore the unmistakable stamp of multiple sources of parentage. Marsh moved to analyze the photograph's background. The farmhouse behind the family showed details now: peeling paint, a broken shutter hanging at an angle, windows covered with cloth rather than curtains. But there was something else, something Marsh highlighted by inverting the image colors. Behind one of the covered windows, a shadow moved. Marsh enhanced it frame by frame, though the photograph was a single frozen moment. The shape suggested a fourth figure inside the house, watching the photograph being taken. The build was unmistakably male, heavier and taller than Samuel. "Elias," Brennan whispered. He stayed inside while they posed. He was watching them, making sure they followed his instructions. The photograph had become more than evidence of Samuel's presence. It was a portrait of complete family degradation. 3 siblings forced together, children born of their union already visible in the frame, and the patriarch lurking in shadow, orchestrating everything. The photographer who captured this image must have sensed the wrongness, must have finished quickly and fled with his camera and his disturbing knowledge. Marsh printed enhanced copies of each detail: the children in the doorway, the infant in Clara's arms, the shadow behind the window. Laid side by side, they told a story more complete than any written record could. The Dowell household in 1899 was already deep in its nightmare, and Samuel had become not the rescuer he had intended to be, but another instrument of the horror his father had created. Armed with the enhanced photographs and Samuel's documented timeline, Brennan returned to the county archives with a new perspective. She was no longer searching for evidence of Elias alone. She was tracking 2 separate patterns of parentage, and the records, once she knew what to look for, revealed them with devastating clarity. The Greene County Almshouse Ledger from 1900 listed an admission in February. Twin females, age 6 weeks, brought from Taney Ridge by midwife Ruth Cantrell. Mother identified as C. Dowell. Infants weak, 1 blind, both with spinal curvature. Died March 4th and March 11th, respectively. Brennan had seen this entry before, but now she noticed what followed. A marginal note in the matron's handwriting read, "Midwife reports both father and uncle present at birth. Dispute over which held authority." Father and uncle, the phrase leapt from the page. In rural Missouri parlance, this meant Elias and Samuel, both claiming some right to the children Clara had borne. Brennan's hands shook as she photographed the entry. This was the first documentary evidence that Samuel had moved beyond mere presence in the household. She found Ruth Cantrell's name in the Taney County marriage records, traced her descendants, and discovered that the midwife's personal papers had been donated to the Missouri State Historical Society in the 1960s. 3 days later, Brennan sat in the Columbia archives reading Cantrell's private journal. The entry for January 1902 was brief, but damning. Called to Dowell Place for Clara. Labor difficult. Twins born before midnight. The father Elias insisted on payment immediate. The brother Samuel would not leave the room, claimed the children were his concern. I saw how Clara looked at the young man, not as brother, but as something else. God forgive what goes on in that house. Further entries documented additional visits. In November 1903, Cantrell recorded attending Eliza, delivered of a son, malformed about the head, lived only 2 days. The notation following read, the brother Samuel held the child after, weeping. He called it by name, Thomas, as if he had chosen it himself. Brennan cross-referenced these dates with birth certificates filed in 3 surrounding counties, a common practice when families wanted to obscure their local reputation. She found records scattered across Taney, Christian, and Stone counties, each listing Dowell as surname, but with telling variations in the father's designation. Some listed E. Dowell as father. Others showed S. Dowell. Several used only initials. One certificate from 1904 recorded the father as E. and S. Dowell, as if the clerk could not determine which man to list, and simply recorded both. The mother in that case was Eliza, and the child, a girl named Mary, had lived 4 months before succumbing to what the death certificate termed constitutional weakness. The pattern became undeniable. Between Samuel's arrival in 1898 and his death in 1914, the frequency of births from the Dowell household doubled. Where Elias alone had fathered perhaps 1 child every 2 years, the records now showed multiple births annually. The sisters were being subjected to both father and brother, their bodies producing children from separate sources of parentage, each child carrying the compounded genetic damage of blood turned back upon itself. Physician notes, where they existed, documented the progression. A doctor in Branson, who examined 1 infant in 1906, wrote, hydrocephalic male, parentage suspect, demonstrates markers consistent with multi-generational consanguinity. Both paternal and maternal lines appear compromised. In plainer terms, the child bore evidence not just of 1 generation of inbreeding, but of multiple. The most chilling document Brennan uncovered was a letter from Dr. Samuel Whitaker, the same physician who had recorded attending a Dowell girl in the original story. Writing to a colleague in 1908, he described examining one of the sisters, though he did not specify which. The patient shows signs of multiple recent pregnancies, perhaps 6 or 7 in as many years. When questioned about the father of her children, she would not speak, but the young man present, identified as her brother, answered for her, stating the children were family matters alone. Brennan closed the archive boxes and sat in the reading room, overwhelmed by what the documents revealed. The Dowell tragedy had not been 1 man's crime, but 2 men's. Samuel had returned to the ridge perhaps with good intentions, but the isolation, the twisted authority of his father, and the desperate circumstances of his sisters had corrupted him completely. By 1900, he was no longer trying to save Eliza and Clara. He had become their second tormentor, and the children they bore carried the genetic evidence of a nightmare that had expanded to consume all 3 siblings. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While researching Samuel's Arkansas background, Brennan contacted the Pulaski County Historical Society and inquired about the Gifford family who had raised him. A volunteer archivist mentioned that a box of Gifford family correspondence had been donated in the 1980s, mostly unexamined because the family had no local prominence. Buried in that box were 11 letters written by Samuel Dowell to his childhood friend, a man named Jacob Hensley, who had grown up alongside him in Little Rock. The letters spanned from 1899 to 1903, and they documented Samuel's descent with horrifying clarity. The first letter, dated March 1899, vibrated with righteous purpose. My dear friend Jacob, I have found my sisters at last, though the discovery brings me more grief than joy. They live as prisoners. Here, pale shadows of what young women should be. Our Father has kept them from the world, and I fear his intentions toward them are unwholesome. I mean to stay until I can persuade them to leave this place, though Father opposes my every word. Pray for us, Jacob. We are in darkness here." By August of that same year, the tone had shifted. "The girls will not leave. I have tried every argument, every plea, but they refuse to abandon the ridge. They say this is their home, their duty. I begin to understand the hold Father has over them, not merely through force, but through years of isolation that have twisted their thinking. I cannot leave them to this fate, Jacob. I must stay, though it costs me everything." The third letter, written in January 1900, contained the first hint of Samuel's corruption. "I have become part of this household in ways I never intended. The girls look to me now not just as brother, but as their only hope of protection from Father's demands. Yet in protecting them, I find myself drawn into the very patterns I sought to break. The isolation here breeds strange thoughts, Jacob. There are only 4 of us on this ridge, and the boundaries that should separate family have grown unclear." Brennan read that passage 3 times, her stomach churning. Samuel was confessing, in careful language, that he had already crossed lines that should have been absolute. The letter continued. "A child was born here last month. The girls will not say whose it is, and Father claims it as his. But I held that infant in my arms and wondered. Clara looks at me with eyes that hold both fear and something else I cannot name." The letters became less frequent after 1900. One from May 1901 was brief and evasive. "Do not write to me again, asking if I will return to Arkansas. My place is here now. The girls have borne more children, and someone must care for them when Father will not. I have accepted my duty, Jacob, whatever you might think of it." The longest letter came in September 1902, written in a hand that trembled across the page. "You ask if I have become like Father. Perhaps I have. I no longer know where his sins end and mine begin. Clara bore twins this summer. Eliza carries another child now. The babies rarely live, Jacob, and perhaps that is mercy. They come into this world already broken, their faces strange, their bodies weak. The midwife looks at me with accusation, but she does not understand. We are bound by more than blood here. We are bound by isolation so complete that the outside world has ceased to exist. There is only the ridge, only the 4 of us, only the children that come and go like shadows." The final letter, dated April 1903, contained a single paragraph that served as Samuel's epitaph to his former self. "I can no longer distinguish between what Father forced upon this family and what I have chosen. The girls no longer flinch when I approach. The children born here carry my features as clearly as Father's. I have become what I returned to prevent, and there is no redemption for such transformation. Do not write again, Jacob. Let me be dead to you, as I am dead to the man I once was." The envelope had been returned unopened. Jacob Hensley had written across it, "Refused. May God have mercy on your soul." But he had kept the letters, perhaps as evidence, perhaps as a record of how completely a good intention could be perverted. They had survived in that dusty box for 90 years, waiting for someone to understand their terrible significance. Samuel Dowell had documented his own corruption, and his words proved what the birth records had suggested. The nightmare on the ridge had been authored by 2 men, not 1. Brennan spent 3 weeks traveling between county courthouses, methodically searching birth and death records across southwest Missouri. What emerged was a map of deliberate obfuscation. The Dowell family had scattered their documentation across 5 counties, filing births in whichever jurisdiction asked the fewest questions. But when assembled chronologically, the records told a story more comprehensive than any single source could. The Christian County Courthouse held the oldest relevant certificate, dated November 1899. Mother listed as Eliza Dowell, father as E. Dowell, farmer. The child, a boy, died at 3 weeks from what the attending physician termed failure to thrive, congenital defects present. Standard enough, matching the pattern established before Samuel's return. But the next certificate, filed in Stone County just 4 months later, showed a telling variation. Mother, Clara Dowell. Father, S.D. Residence, Taney County. The clerk had abbreviated the father's name, either from discretion or disgust, but the initials were unmistakable. This infant, a girl, survived only 9 days. The death certificate noted, severe hydrocephalus, incompatible with life. From 1900 forward, the pattern alternated with grim regularity. Certificates listing E. Dowell as father appeared alongside those showing S. Dowell, or simply S.D. Some clerks had written father, household member, as if unable to force themselves to record the specific relationship. One certificate from 1902 carried a notation that made Brennan's blood run cold. Twin females born to C. Dowell, paternity disputed between E.D. and S.D., both present at registration. The clerk in that case had documented what the midwife's journal had described, an actual dispute between Elias and Samuel, over which man had fathered Clara's twins. Neither felt shame enough to avoid the argument in front of a county official. The twins had died within weeks of each other, buried in separate cemeteries, as if the family hoped to hide the evidence of their multiplicity. Brennan created a spreadsheet, entering every birth she could document. By the time she finished, she had identified 23 children born to Eliza and Clara between 1898 and 1914. Of these, 8 showed clear attribution to Elias through the E. Dowell designation. 9 listed Samuel through variations of his initials. 6 remained ambiguous, marked only as Dowell household, or with no father listed at all. The dates revealed something even more disturbing. In several instances, both sisters gave birth within months of each other, sometimes simultaneously. The twins born to Clara in 1902 arrived in January. Eliza delivered a son in March of the same year. Both women pregnant at once, carrying children from different fathers, their bodies used as vessels in a competition between father and son that treated them as property rather than human beings. Medical descriptions in the death certificates showed consistent patterns of genetic damage. Hydrocephalus appeared in 12 cases, spinal deformities in 7, blindness or severe visual impairment in 9. Several certificates used the phrase constitutional weakness, which physicians employed when the defects were too numerous or too disturbing to catalog completely. But what chilled Brennan most was the progression over time. The earliest children, those born before 1900, showed relatively fewer abnormalities compared to those born after 1905. By 1910, nearly every certificate described multiple severe defects in a single infant. The genetic damage was compounding, each generation of inbreeding producing children more compromised than the last. A physician in Forsyth had noted this progression in a letter Brennan found attached to one death certificate from 1908. This infant represents the worst case of consanguineous birth defects I have witnessed in 30 years of practice. The mother and her sister have borne so many children to close blood relations that the family line has become poisoned beyond recovery. Any further pregnancies will produce only suffering. Yet the pregnancies continued. The final birth certificate Brennan located was dated May 1913, filed in Taney County. Mother, Eliza Dowell, age 33. Father, listed only as SD. The child, a boy, lived 6 weeks before dying of what the certificate termed general systemic failure, multiple organ malformation. Samuel had still been fathering children with his sister just a year before his death from influenza. Brennan laid out the certificates in chronological order across her dining room table. 23 documents representing 23 brief lists. Together, they formed irrefutable proof that the Dowell household had operated as a closed system of abuse, involving not one perpetrator, but 2. With the sisters trapped between them, bearing children whose bodies testified to the horror of their conception. While Brennan pursued documentary evidence, Martin Keller became obsessed with the tin box itself. The photograph had come from somewhere, passed through hands and generations before arriving at that Branson estate sale. Understanding its journey might reveal how such damning evidence had survived when the Dowell family seemed determined to erase their tracks. Keller contacted the estate sale company and obtained the name of the deceased, whose belongings had been sold. Margaret Tinsdale, aged 87, died in February 1995 with no immediate family. Her executor, a distant cousin, had simply wanted the house emptied. The cousin remembered nothing about the tin box, said Margaret never spoke of her family history, but property records told a different story. Margaret's maiden name was Gifford. She was the granddaughter of Thomas and Ruth Gifford, the Arkansas couple who had raised Samuel. The tin box had traveled from Samuel's effects to his adoptive family, then through 3 generations of Giffords, until Margaret moved to Missouri in the 1950s. She had carried Samuel's secrets with her, locked in that box, for 40 years. Keller returned to examining the box itself, looking for anything he might have missed. The photograph had occupied the top layer, but beneath it lay items he had barely glanced at during his initial discovery. A lock of dark hair tied with a ribbon, brittle with age, a child's leather shoe, tiny enough to fit an infant, worn smooth at the toe. And folded beneath these items, a piece of paper he had assumed was mere packing material. The paper, when carefully unfolded, revealed itself as a letter written in Samuel's hand. The ink had faded to brown, the creases threatened to tear, but the words remained legible. It was dated December 1913, just months before Samuel's death. To whoever finds this box, I leave this testament not as excuse, but as confession. The photograph shows us as we were in 1899, before the worst had fully taken hold. I returned to Missouri, seeking to save my sisters from our father's tyranny. Instead, I became his mirror. The letter continued in cramped script that grew more desperate as it progressed. Eliza and Clara were victims first of Elias, then of me. I told myself I was protecting them, that my presence gave them choice where father had allowed none. But choice in such circumstances is illusion. The ridge became a prison for all of us, and in that prison, I discovered capacities for sin I had not known I possessed. Samuel described the isolation in stark terms. We were 4 souls alone on that ridge, cut off by winter snows and by shame. The children came year after year, each more damaged than the last. I held them as they died, these infants who should never have drawn breath, and I knew I had helped create them. Not all were fathers. Many were mine. The sisters bore children to both of us, their bodies breaking under the burden. The most devastating passage came near the end. The photograph preserves the moment before I fully understood what I had become. You can see it in my face if you look closely. I still believed I might save them, but the children in the doorway tell the truth. They already bore my features mixed with my sister's. I had not saved anyone. I had only multiplied the horror. Samuel wrote of his isolation from everyone who had known him before. Jacob refused my letters. The church turned us away. We existed outside the boundaries of human society, and in that void, natural law ceased to apply. Father died in 1912, but by then it mattered little. I had already become him. The letter concluded with instructions. I have gathered these items as evidence for a judgment I will never face in earthly courts. The lock of hair belonged to Thomas, Clara's son, who lived 2 days. The shoe was worn by Margaret, Eliza's daughter, who survived 4 months. The photograph shows us all, guilty and innocent together. Let it stand as testament that silence is not mercy, but cruelty compounded. He had signed it simply, Samuel Dowell, damned. Keller sat with the letter for a long time before calling Brennan. Samuel had created his own archive of guilt, preserved it in a tin box, and entrusted it to the family who had raised him. The Giffords had kept it sealed, passing it down with instructions never to open it, never to speak of it. But time erodes all secrets, and eventually the box had ended up at an estate sale where someone finally broke the seal. The photograph was not just evidence. It was Samuel's deliberate confession, preserved alongside tokens of the children he had helped destroy. He had known what he was doing, had documented it with the cold clarity of someone beyond redemption, and he had made certain that someday someone would understand the full scope of what had happened on that ridge. By August 1995, Brennan had assembled what she believed to be the complete record of the Dowell tragedy. Birth certificates, death records, almshouse ledgers, physician notes, and Samuel's confession formed a documentary chain that stretched from 1897 to 1920. She contacted Dr. Helena Voss, a medical geneticist at Johns Hopkins University, who specialized in the historical analysis of genetic disorders and consanguinity cases. Voss traveled to Springfield with a team of graduate researchers, and together they created a comprehensive genealogical chart mapping every documented birth. The final count exceeded even Brennan's grim expectations. Between 1897 and 1920, the Dowell sisters had given birth to at least 29 children. Birth certificates existed for 23. Almshouse records, physician notes, and burial registers suggested at least 6 more who were never officially recorded. Of the 29 documented children, only 4 lived past their first birthday. 3 of those died before age 5. The single survivor, a girl named Ruth, born in 1907 to Clara, lived until age 12 before dying of what physicians termed complications from congenital abnormalities. She had been partially blind, severely developmentally delayed, and according to the almshouse matron who cared for her final years, unable to speak or care for herself in any capacity. Voss analyzed the medical descriptions from death certificates and physician reports, translating the archaic terminology into modern genetic understanding. What we're seeing here is compounded consanguinity, she explained to Brennan. The children born before 1900, when only Elias was the father, showed typical first-generation incest effects, increased rates of recessive disorders, some physical abnormalities, higher infant mortality. She pointed to certificates from 1902 onward. But once Samuel entered the picture, the genetic damage escalated catastrophically. The sisters were bearing children to both their father and their brother. Some of those children survived long enough to potentially reproduce, though there's no evidence they did. Each pregnancy drew from an increasingly poisoned genetic pool. The twin births particularly interested Voss. Between 1900 and 1912, the records showed 7 sets of twins born to the Dowell sisters. Twin pregnancies are often more fragile than single births, Voss noted. In cases of severe consanguinity, the rates of twin mortality approach 90%. None of the Dowell twins survived more than 3 months. Several died within hours. Voss created a timeline showing the progression of genetic damage. The earliest children showed relatively isolated defects: a clubfoot here, partial blindness there, moderate developmental delays. But by 1905, the medical descriptions had become catalogs of horror. One certificate from 1906 described an infant with hydrocephalus, cleft palate, malformed limbs, apparent cardiac defect, survived 8 hours. Another from 1909 recorded twin males, both blind, one lacking fully formed skull, second with exposed spine, died at birth. The compounding became geometrically worse with each pregnancy. Voss explained it in terms that made Brennan's hands shake. Imagine a genetic deck of cards where 20% are already damaged. Each shuffle pulls from that same deck. By the 10th shuffle, you're almost guaranteed to draw only damaged cards. By the 20th shuffle, you're producing combinations incompatible with life. That was what had happened to Eliza and Clara. Their bodies had become factories of genetic catastrophe, producing children who carried accumulated damage from multiple generations of inbreeding. Some infants died in the womb. Others lived hours or days, their brief existence marked only by suffering. The geographical distribution of deaths revealed another disturbing pattern. Brennan had found infant burials attributed to the Dowell family across 7 counties and at least 15 separate cemeteries. The family had scattered the evidence, never burying more than 1 or 2 children in the same location, avoiding the questions that a cluster of infant graves might provoke. But some children never reached cemeteries at all. Hunters had reported unmarked graves near the ridge throughout the early 20th century. County officials investigated twice, in 1907 and 1911, but found insufficient evidence to prosecute. The sisters would not testify. Elias and Samuel denied everything. The graves themselves yielded only small bones that could not be definitively identified. Voss's final report, delivered in September 1995, concluded with language that would make the Dowell case a reference point in genetic studies for decades. This represents the most severe documented case of multi-generational, multi-perpetrator, incestuous reproduction in American medical history. The genetic damage compounded across at least 29 births, producing infant mortality rates exceeding 90% and profound abnormalities in all documented cases. The 2 female victims, subjected to continuous pregnancy by both father and brother across more than 20 years, endured physical and psychological trauma almost beyond comprehension. 29 children, 29 brief lives snuffed out by the sins of their conception. And at the center of it all, 2 women whose names appeared on certificate after certificate, reduced to nothing more than vessels for a nightmare that consumed 2 decades. In November 1995, the photograph and all accompanying documentation were formally donated to the Missouri State Archives. Brennan had spent 7 months reconstructing the complete story, and now it would be preserved for historians, geneticists, and anyone seeking to understand how thoroughly silence can enable horror. The photograph occupies a climate-controlled vault in Jefferson City, cataloged as evidence of what archivists termed the most comprehensive case of documented familial abuse and genetic catastrophe in Missouri history. Visitors who request to view it must sign acknowledgement forms and receive briefings about its disturbing content. Most who see it spend only moments before asking for it to be returned to storage. What makes the image so unbearable is not the visible suffering, but the absence of it. Eliza, Clara, and Samuel stare at the camera with expressions of blank resignation, as if they had already accepted their damnation. There is no defiance in their eyes, no plea for help, only the exhausted compliance of people who have stopped fighting. The children in the doorway appear as ghosts, their features blurred by the photographer's hurried work. And the infant in Clara's arms serves as the photograph's terrible centerpiece, proof that the nightmare was not approaching, but already complete. Brennan's research culminated in a published report that appeared in the Journal of Genetic History in 1996. The article, titled Multi-Perpetrator Consanguinity, the Dowell Case, 1897 to 1920, became required reading in medical ethics courses and criminal psychology programs. It detailed not just the genetic catastrophe, but the social failures that allowed it to continue for more than 2 decades. The report identified specific moments when intervention could have stopped the abuse. Reverend Carter's unsent letter to the sheriff in 1899, the midwife's testimony about disputed paternity in 1902, the coroner's investigations of unmarked graves in 1907 and 1911. Each represented a point where someone knew enough to act, but chose silence instead, whether from fear, discretion, or the belief that family matters lay beyond public authority. Brennan traced the sisters' fate beyond the known records. Census data from 1920 listed only Eliza Dowell, aged 40, living alone on the ridge. Clara had vanished from all documentation after 1917, her fate unknown. No death certificate exists, no burial record. She simply disappeared from history, possibly dying unreported and buried in an unmarked grave like so many of her children. Eliza herself died in 1924, according to a brief notice in the Springfield Republican. The obituary listed no survivors, no service, no family to mourn her. She was buried in the Forsyth Cemetery in a plot marked only with a wooden cross that has since rotted away. The woman who had endured more than 20 years of continuous abuse, who had borne at least 15 children to her father and brother, who had watched nearly all of them die in infancy, passed from the world as anonymously as she had lived. The Ridge House collapsed sometime in the 1930s. Locals reported that no one would buy the property, that even decades later, people avoided the land as cursed. By the 1950s, forest had reclaimed the fields, and only a stone chimney marked where the Dowell homestead had stood. Even that crumbled eventually, leaving nothing but a slight depression in the earth and the faint outline of a foundation. But the photograph ensures the story cannot be forgotten. Modern visitors to the archives see what the people of Taney County in 1899 could only whisper about: 3 siblings bound together in a hell created by isolation, patriarchal tyranny, and the progressive corruption of a young man who had meant to be a rescuer. The children visible in that frozen moment represent not just the victims of Elias, Dowell's original crime, but the compounded horror that occurred when Samuel crossed the same boundaries he had returned to defend. The Dowell case stands today as a testament to what happens when communities choose silence over intervention, when family privacy is valued above human welfare, when women are stripped of agency and reduced to vessels. Those 29 children, their lives measured in hours and days rather than years, speak across the decades with silent accusation. And the photograph, enhanced by modern technology to reveal every terrible detail, ensures that their brief existence will never be erased from memory. This is the legacy of the last disturbing photo of the Dowell sisters. Not just evidence of what happened, but a reminder of what we allow to happen when we turn away from uncomfortable truths. Stories like this don't disappear because we stop talking about them. They hide in attics and archives, waiting for someone brave enough to bring them into the light. If you found this investigation as haunting as we did, click that like button and subscribe to the channel. We're not just telling dark stories, we're preserving the voices that history tried to silence. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that the worst monsters aren't always strangers. They're sometimes the ones who claim to love us. Until next time, keep searching for truth, no matter how dark the path.